So recently, my good friend Ryan Leith put out a video called 10 Great Albums I Discovered in 2020. Basically, the concept is just his 10 favorite albums that he discovered and listened to a lot this year, but they weren't actually released in 2020. And behind the scenes, he kind of put out the call for other YouTubers such as myself to make similar videos, talking about our personal favorite albums that we discovered this year, and I had actually considered doing something similar to this last year, but for songs, but I never ended up finishing the video, so it's already a concept that I think is really cool, so I thought, why not share my personal picks for the 10 favorite albums I discovered in 2020. Now for me personally, these didn't necessarily have to be super unknown deep cuts, they're just any album that I hadn't heard prior to this year that really stuck out and made a strong impression on me. For example, the first album I have here is A Weekend in the City by Block Party. Now Block Party are a pretty widely acclaimed band, and this album here even went platinum in England. Over here in North America, it wasn't quite as big, but it did still chart pretty highly on the US and Canadian album charts. But it seems that over time, this album has not been remembered nearly as strongly as their debut Silent Alarm has been. That album, you'll see people talking about it all the time, heralding it as one of the greatest albums of all time, or at least certainly of the 2000s. But this album here, I never really saw anyone talk about it except maybe a couple of my close friends who are big Block Party fans. I actually hadn't heard Silent Alarm until last year, but I really loved it, and now it has since become one of my favorite albums. So it was only natural that this year I checked out their sophomore release, and while it definitely isn't quite as good as Silent Alarm, I still think it's a very strong project, and based on a lot of the critical and fan reaction to this, I would say that it's pretty underrated. I think they really did a good job of evolving while still embracing what made them great in the first place, you know, the awesome vocals, the really melancholic atmosphere, the fantastic riffs, and they expand on that here with some electronic elements, like on the start of Hunting for Witches when you get those chopped up vocal samples, and the heavily synthetic flux, which I know isn't part of the original track listing, but it's part of the track list that I was listening to. The lyrics are very strong on this album, with potent song concepts on tracks like Hunting for Witches, Waiting for the 718, and Uniform. Overall, I think it's a really strong rock album, and it has me pretty excited to check out the rest of Block Party's discography, even if it's also not that critically acclaimed. Up next, we have my favorite discovery from an artist who I grew to love pretty immensely in 2020, and that would be Back from the Dead 3 by Chief Keef. Now, the Back from the Dead trilogy is pretty infamous. The first two are pretty much certified classic mixtapes at this point. But Back from the Dead 3 is a project that you almost wouldn't know existed if you weren't part of circles that frequently discussed Chief Keef. Until I fully dove into his discography, I didn't know he had even made a Back from the Dead 3. And if you look at these songs on YouTube or SoundCloud, you'll see that they all have a fraction of the plays that the first Back from the Dead's had. And to me, that's kind of a shame, because this might be my personal favorite of the three. The first two are incredible, don't get me wrong, and all three of them were super fresh and experimental and even groundbreaking in some ways when they first dropped. Like, neither of these projects sounded like anything else that was being released at the time. But they're all also very stylistically different from each other too. On each one, Keef is trying a whole new sound. And the sound that he crafted on this tape, I really have never heard anything like it. Keef fans typically refer to this era as his underwater era, and to me that's perfectly named because he uses this vocal filter all across this project that makes it sound like his voice is underwater and that his vocals are just drowning in these instrumentals, and that effect alone is super unique. I've never heard any rapper use anything like it. And the way it blends Keef's voice in with these beats is just very immersive and hypnotic, and those are two words you could also use to describe this entire project. To me, there's a very darkly psychedelic sound to this record. It definitely feels pitch black, but it's also super trippy. I love on a lot of these tracks when Keef just coats the background with these melodically sung ad-libs using that same vocal filter, and the way that they build on top of each other, and also the way that the melodies he uses mixes with the melodies in the production. It's just like he uses his voice as an instrument on this project, not only with his main rapping, but with his ad-libs that he's singing in the background. And the way he uses those really slurred, strung out melodic ad-libs to build on those beats is another thing I find super creative about this project and adds a really cool sound to the whole thing. Production-wise, I think this thing is super experimental and creative as well. He plays around with both minimalism and maximalism on this project. Songs like Vietnam, Glatt, and Pharrell have weirdly minimalist instrumentals that some of them, especially Vietnam, I just really was not into at first. I was like, how the fuck is this enjoyable? It's so bare and sparse, and there's barely any drums here. Like, what's the appeal? But once I started listening to the project more, I really appreciated how he made those tracks work. Whether it's on Vietnam, where the brash horns get so maddeningly hypnotic that I can't help but get lost in its almost manic energy, and then there's the song Pharrell, where Keef proves that you don't need drums to make a song that just sounds hard as fuck. But then there's tracks like Bestie, Baseball Bat, and Just What It Be Like, where there's just so many layers of strange, blackened, kaleidoscopic synths, paired, like I said, with also those waves of melodies that he's slurring on with in the background. And these tracks to me come off as sounding honestly otherworldly, especially Bestie and Baseball Bat. Like, I've never heard any tracks from Keef or anyone else that are comparable to those two lyrically across this project. I really like a lot of the bars that Keef is bringing. I kind of like how he has almost like a Mark Kozlik approach to rap, in which he just says any and everything that is on his mind, and you'll just hear the most random content and stories about his life from him. And when I say stories, it's definitely just like, you know, a couple lines describing something that happens in his life, but it's just like weird random shit, and it just is really entertaining to me. Plus, he also just does have a lot of bars that I think are really hard and are sometimes pretty clever. Flow-wise, I think he killed it. I could keep going on about this album forever, but I should definitely stop myself. So I'm just gonna go ahead and move to my next pick here, which is Vapor City by Machine Drum. This is a wonderful blend of footwork, jungle, and some other electronic subgenres. The production quality and the engineering on here just makes this thing have the most pristine and beautiful sound quality that you could hope for from a record. The drums on this thing sound fantastic. I love the sample work on songs like Gunshotta, Don't Want to Lose You, and Eyes Don't Lie. The atmosphere that he crafts on here will absolutely suck you in if it's an album that's up your alley. It's definitely the perfect album for a late night walk, in my opinion. I'll close by saying that I also feel that Machine Drum is just a pretty underrated artist overall, and you guys should also check out his albums Rooms and A View of You. My next pick is Ice Cream and Mac 10s by Black Cray. I've listened to a lot of stuff that could be dubbed cloud rap over the years, but most of what I've heard from the genre is more hi-fi sounding stuff that just feels very syrupy and polished and psychedelic. But this project's vein of more lo-fi, intentionally, roughly mixed cloud rap is something that I've heard in bits and pieces. You know, I've heard some Viper songs here and there, but I've never really dove into a full project like this until now, and it definitely did take a few listens for me to get accustomed to it, just because of what my former perception of cloud rap was. It was just so weird for me hearing songs like Louis V Hum a Truck, Gucci Speedboats, Dennis Rodman, Uzi Edwards. The extremely loosely and weirdly structured nature of those songs, paired with their more harsher lo-fi elements, just came off really jarring for me. Trying to take it in like just more normal rap music just wasn't working for me. But when I stopped trying to look for anthemic hooks or catchy flows or really punchy to the point beats, and I kind of just laid back and let myself soak this thing in, I started to really see where the appeal comes from. At this point, to me, the overly drawn out intros, the unconventionally structured beats, the total layers of chaos that I'm hearing, where it almost feels like nothing succinctly fits together in a musical way, but what they do is they just create this icy haze that just kind of washes over me and definitely induces a very trippy experience. I would say I've never heard anything that sounds like this before, but I feel like if I actually dove more into this style of cloud rap, I'd find a lot of stuff that sounds like it, so I won't use that line here. But what I will say is that from what I know, Black Cray was one of the first to make music like this. This project in particular is heralded as kind of an underground classic and as being very influential. So either way, I think this is an extremely creative project, definitely very unorthodox and off the beaten path for a hip-hop project. Honestly, I would totally understand if some people out there thought that this was just terrible, but personally, I loved it. Up next, I have Monomila Rose by Playboi Carti. I mean, Françoise Hardy? What? Now, although she is quite the iconic figure, she's definitely not nearly as well known in North America, and she also has quite a massive discography, so there's a lot of projects of hers that are really fantastic, but they just aren't talked about as much as her most famous works, such as Self-Titled or her debut album. This here is one of her earliest releases. I think it's her 4th album, and for me, I think it's a perfect meeting point of the really simplistic, lighthearted, and free-spirited sound of her debut record that is just very simple in terms of the compositions. It's very acoustic heavy, but the songs are just so pretty, so feel good, so uplifting, just have such a happy vibe to them. I feel like you get that same pure and simple and blissful vibe on here, and even songs like Tu ne dis rien et pars even also have that same stripped back acoustic sound of the debut album. But then alongside that, you're also starting to see the very rich and lavish instrumentation that would become a staple of her later music. Je veux qu'il revienne, Tu n'as que mot à dire, Je n'attends plus personne, and many others just have extremely gorgeous, lush instrumentation that, accompanied by François' absolutely lovely voice, just make for some of the most whimsical songs I've heard. And while most of this thing is definitely ready to sweep you off your feet, I also really appreciate the titular closer on here that actually has a more dark and mysterious vibe to it, something that I hadn't heard François do up to this point. Next is Life of a Hot Boy by Bankroll Fresh. I've known about Bankroll ever since he unfortunately passed away, just because, as usual, when a rapper dies, they usually start getting lauded a lot more posthumously. But even even though his name became pretty well known, his music mostly stayed relatively underground. He had a few big songs like Hot Boy, but even that track only has about 15 million views on YouTube after 6 years of being released. So I think it's fair to say that this is a pretty overlooked mixtape here, but in my opinion it absolutely should not be. This thing is just southern trap at its best. Bankroll's flows across this project are absolutely fire, and I think they're really creative a lot of the time too on songs like ESPN, All Out, and New York Freestyle. He also comes with a pretty wide variety of sounds on here. For a 24-track project, there's definitely enough diversity for me to stay interested from start to finish. A few songs here or there like Show 'Em How to Do It and Haters start to get a little bit repetitive just because they use similar flows, but even those are pretty few and far between, so they really don't affect the overall quality of the project too much for me. The beats on this thing are also dope as fuck. There's so many bangers on here. Honestly, maybe some of the best trap beats I've ever heard, courtesy of D Rich. I especially think that Dope Boy Shit is just one of the most monstrous beats I've ever heard. I also love how fresh Bankroll keeps it in terms of his delivery. You know, you listen to songs like How I Wanna Live or New York Freestyle, you see that he does provide a lot of variety with his voice as well. So I just think overall this is a super dope mixtape and definitely one you should listen to if you're a big fan of Southern trap. If you're a big fan of The Cure like myself, I would highly suggest checking out the album Modern Mirror by Drab Majesty, a really well done dark wave and gothic rock album. It has an awesome nocturnal and ethereal atmosphere. It's very romantic but cold feeling at the same time, just as I would love any great goth rock album to be. While it definitely feels influenced by artists like The Cure, I think it does have its own unique spin, especially with the more updated synths that you'll find on here. I think the songwriting on here is very strong as well, a dialogue, ellipsis, and oxytocin being favorites of mine in that department. Moving on from there, we have Live Shine Die by Uno the Activist. Now this is more so the sound of cloud rap that I am used to, just very icy, hazy, psychedelic sounding beats that just feel very sugary and satisfying to consume. What makes this one special to me is honestly Uno himself. I think he is a fantastic trap rapper. To me, he brings the insane flowing abilities of Young Thug and pairs that with the really bouncy nature of someone like a Playboi Carti, but I don't want to say that he's influenced by Carti because they both came up around the same time. They're actually cousins, and I think it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing in terms of, you know, which one of them actually had that sound first. But overall, because of his honestly pretty complex and speedy flows at times, he's not similar to Carti at all. He is definitely a much better rapper in the technical sense. The beats are super immersive and kaleidoscopic. The choruses are often super catchy. There's nothing complex about this, but I just think it's a really awesome cloud rap slash trap album. Another album that isn't exactly underground, but I just personally didn't check it out until this year would be Cupid Deluxe by Blood Orange. Blood Orange's 2018 album was actually the first of his that I ever heard, but since I absolutely adored it and it was one of my favorite albums of 2018, I definitely had to go back and check out his other projects, and I tried Coastal Grooves and Freetown Sound in 2019, really loved them both, but this year I checked out the final project of his that I hadn't heard, Cupid Deluxe, and it ended up being my favorite of the three. I think his 2018 project is still my favorite overall, but Cupid Deluxe comes pretty damn close for me. I mean, right off the bat with Chamake, the vibraphone, or whatever similar instrument that comes in to start the track, just sets up a totally unique vibe to any other song I had heard from him, both past or present. I'll never forget the first time I heard that track. I thought it was the best thing ever. I was just dancing my ass off for about 15 minutes to it because I played it back like 3 times. I think a lot of the songs on here also continue that trend of not sounding like anything else Blood Orange has done to date, whether that be High Street, Clipped On, or Uncle Ace. And each of those are quite different from each other as well. I think Clipped On might be my favorite of the 3 with those really cool drums and Despot's verse on top of it. Then you get songs like It Is What It Is, Always Let You Down, and You're Not Good Enough, which, yeah, they definitely sound like something that could have been on either Freetown Sound or Coastal Grooves, but they're still fantastically written Blood Orange songs that are simultaneously super cloudy and atmospheric, very depressing and melancholic sounding, but also very catchy and poppy. The intersection of those 3 things is honestly where Blood Orange just absolutely thrives. His really vulnerable vocals just fit that sound perfectly, and the production overall just has that very glamorous, sparkly feel that you're used to from any Blood Orange project. His production is always immaculate to me. And now for the final album I have chosen for this video, that would be Fredo Krueger 2 by Fredo Santana. Since I got really big into Chief Keef this year, I also branched out and tried a lot of other drill artists, and so far I think this is probably my favorite drill album I've heard from someone who's not Chief Keef. Fredo has always had a pretty unique to drill, where most of his contemporaries sound very bombastic and aggressive. He takes a more cold and reserved approach to rapping on his songs. He does occasionally get more explosive and brash, but he typically just plays this really cool, collected guy who isn't really in your face or trying to draw too too much attention to himself, but everyone around him knows that he means business, and you just hear in his voice that coldness, and you know that he's still not someone to fuck with. So you get that on this project as per usual, but there's also a lot of weird stuff that Fredo does on this project that I just think make it really cool. A lot of the flows he brings on this project on songs like Energy, Demons, or The Program, they're very unconventional. I appreciated them a lot initially, but especially the more I've gotten to know this project and actually trying to rap along to some of these songs, like he's actually bringing some pretty fucking creative flows on this thing and some pretty unorthodox rap patterns. He also plays around with his voice more than I've ever heard from him. You get that on songs like Want My Spot or Turn They Back. Then there's tracks like Bin Savage and The Program, where the way that he uses auto-tune is really weird, like especially on Bin Savage, the way that for a lot of it he's just rapping without auto-tune in his normal delivery, but then he just throws in these random auto-tune sections at different points that gives it a really interesting effect to me. And then just on The Program, the way that he raps through the auto-tune and the melodies he's using just feel very strange. And then the few songs on here that do just sound more typical as far as drill music goes, which is pretty much just all the songs that feature Chief Keef, they're still fucking bangers. They still have crazy ass beats, a ton of energy. They definitely don't feel like filler. They honestly are some of the best, just, you know, traditional sounding drill songs I feel like I've heard. And the last thing I'll say about this is that Fredo lyrically is bringing plenty of bars that are just some of the hardest I've ever heard. There's one that always sticks out to me where he's talking about how he's not afraid of going to hell, because when he does, he'll just slap the shit out of the devil and then start running it himself, which is just one of the hardest and most psychotic bars I've ever heard. I love it. So those are my picks for my 10 favorite albums that I discovered in 2020. Hopefully there was some stuff in here that sounded interesting to some of you guys. And also definitely let me know what some of your favorite albums that you discovered this year were. Other than that, thank you guys as always for watching, and I'll see you next time.